All right, welcome to the On the Blue Line podcast. I'm your host, Wayne Mulder, and I'm excited to be back with you again this week. This week, I have for you an update on the Chicago situation with the officers, a little bit of story about salsa in the middle of the highway, and some sad statistics when it comes to officer line of duty deaths. That and, yes, just your mere presence is violence. The On the Blue Line podcast starts now. So welcome to Morning Roll Call. I am the host, Wayne Mulder, and I'm excited to be back with you again this week. If you haven't checked out our other podcast, The Interview Room, I encourage you to do that. Last week, I sat down with Scott Edwards, and I've gotten some really good feedback on that episode. Remember, all of these are available on video, and I'm putting a lot of features and stuff into them for you for video purposes, including links and show notes. So that's what I'm concentrating on. So definitely check us out on YouTube and on Rumble. This next Thursday in the Interview Room, I sit down with John Becker, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy that episode as well. So definitely check those out. Let's get to 3 stories you might have missed. So the first story I want to tell you is an update. If you'll recall, a few weeks ago, I talked with you about Chicago and what was going on with the suicides and some sad news out of there. So there was an update on this story. So clearly there is a mental health correlation, right? When it comes to officers' time off. Working 11 days in a row, 12-hour days is not acceptable. It's just not. Now, does it happen? Have we all done it from time to time? Well, yeah. Hurricanes, major crime investigations, specialty investigations, sure. There are times that they need to do that. But that shouldn't be the norm, right? And there is definitely something that needs to be looked at when it comes to officers' mental health when you're asking them to work every day. In fact, where we see, and I know the detention guys that watch the show, that's one of the main issues where you're going to see it is in your detentions, because these poor guys are getting forced overtime so many times and are having to stay on shift after shift and day after day. So this article came out in Police One, but effective immediately, no more than 1 regular day off will be canceled per week for officers except during certain holidays. And when you read the article, that exception is limited to only 2 during all your major holiday times. Now, there was some dispute, in fairness. The mayor, Lori Lightfoot, and the chief of police, they both argued that it's not as bad as like the FOP and other organizations have been saying, specifically referring to the mule term. So there was a statement where it said they're being worked like mules that the FOP put out, and that did not go over very well with the mayor and with Brown. So if you read the article, here's the good news. Here's the bad news, is that they were arguing whether or not this was actually happening, whether or not he's like, well, in the contract, they have all sorts of hours. And you can go, if you go to ontheblueline.com and go to the show notes, you can actually check out this article for yourself. But he was saying, well, it's really not as bad as you think. However, the Office of Inspector General released a report Monday that looked into the scheduling, and I'm quoting here, scheduling practices of CBD, the Chicago Police Department. And it found from its review of April 1st to May 31st that more than 1,000 officers were scheduled to work 11 or more consecutive days, some as many as 13 days straight. Now, here's the in fairness part that I was trying to get to. And that is that depending on whose math you go with, they're claiming, they being the chief of police, that it only is representing about 10% of the workforce. Again, not the point, right? So hopefully they're getting something worked out there. The entire article also talks about the situation I've been talking about a lot recently with so many officers quitting and leaving the profession, and how this is just playing another part into that. So definitely check that article out, and hopefully in Chicago they will at least not be working 11 days straight or 13 days straight anymore. Story number 2. I'm going to start with the headline. Chain of car crashes caused by 300,000 tomatoes rolling onto California highway. So the California Highway Patrol goes out. Essentially, a large semi runs into, there's a traffic crash. They run into 2 vehicles, and 300,000 tomatoes are spilled across this Northern California highway. The the officer said, quote, "The big rig was carrying a load of tomatoes and all the tomatoes spilled onto the eastbound lanes of the traffic vehicles. The tomato-covered highway soon became too slick for other vehicles to endure, causing a chain reaction of crashes. In fact," and this was the quote that I love, "those tomato skins, man." Ty Hurst. Sorry, y'all got to bear with me. It is Monday morning. "Those tomato skins, man," Ty Hurst told New York Times. "Once they hit the asphalt, it's like walking on ice." The mixture of tomato juice, oil, and dirt caused one vehicle to become stuck in the road. Two others would eventually strike the car. Another vehicle was sideswiped by a car struggling to gain control on slippery interstate. This sounds like snow and ice in the north. It's just absolutely crazy. So 7 vehicles were involved. The good news is there were no fatalities. There were a few injuries and one broken leg. Thank goodness that's all that happened. And they pretty much had to get a backhoe and they got it cleaned up. They brought out some street sweepers, and 2 people put on social media, quote, "You tell your boss you're late for work because of a tomato spill on the highway. Do they believe you?" Well, I guess they have if they've read this article. And others describe the experience as driving through sauce or salsa. So watch out for tomatoes on the highway. And just in case you were wondering, they are slick like ice. I had no idea, but hey, we learned something together. So the third story I want you to be aware of this week is coming to us from Just the News. I'm bringing this up just because it's another one of these stories that we talk about a lot. And since it was another update, I wanted to bring it to you. As gunfire fatalities are on the rise, officers are quitting at never before seen rates, and crime is increasing. Now, those 3 statements aren't necessarily tied to the same thing. If they are all parts of a broader issue, it's kind of weird how they wrote the article. But the part I wanted to bring to your attention was, so they start out with kind of like a good news, and then they go to the bad news. So the good news is overall line of duty deaths, which include officers who die from COVID-19, 9/11 related illnesses, and vehicle crashes, are down so far this year. However, when you look solely at gunfire deaths, they are up. And they were up also in 2021. For instance, 64 officers died from gunfire in the line of duty, which was a 25% increase over 2020. And it goes on to the Fraternal Order of Police President Patrick Yose said in a video published by the organization, because of the rise in crime and anti-police attitude arising from the 2020 George Floyd protest, officers are facing a crisis right now in manpower, Yose stressed. And then they also talk about the increase in crime, which we talked about, I believe, last week or the week before. So I'm not going to bore you with those statistics, but overall it just shows this growing trend that we are seeing, that it's not just your imagination. It's not just the media telling more stories. It's truly happening that these things are going up. We have statistics to show it, and it's coming from this anti-police sentiment and some of these other issues that we're dealing with as a nation. So to that end, let us get to 2 crazy things. So this week for the 2 crazy things, I'm actually just going to tell you one continuing thing. So I'm going to show you a video here. If you haven't seen this video yet, let me start with the preface of why I'm even talking about this incident, right? So it was all over the media and certain groups, and you heard there was a lot on the conservative side. I really didn't hear any liberal outlets talking about it, but a lot on the conservative side. And I'm not bringing it up to jump on that bandwagon. I'm bringing it up because I happen to have been at this event, the company's event, the year prior, and had an interesting experience. And so then when I read this story, I'm like, well, isn't that interesting? So first, take a look at this video. If you haven't seen this yet, you need to. And for those of you listening and not watching online, you're just going to have to come back later and check it out. It's on YouTube and on Rumble on our channel On the Blue Line. But you will see this is at Podcast Movement in Dallas, Texas. Happened a week or so ago. And at Podcast Movement, Daily Wire, the news organization, had they had gotten a booth. There was no necessarily planned appearances by anybody. However, Ben Shapiro, who is one of the co-owners, is my understanding, but he's one of the head guys there at Daily Wire. He shows up. Just meanders. If you're watching the video, he is shaking hands, getting photos taken with people. Everybody who's talking to him is extremely positive. Hey, great job. Love your work, that kind of thing. And he just stands by his booth. Mind you, this is a booth that they are paying for to be at this trade show, right? And then he leaves. I mean, I guess you could accuse him of parading, which who knew what a crime that ended up being, but he's just hanging out. Hey, my company paid for this booth and I just thought I would show up. So in the world of rational thinking, what type of Twitter messages would you expect from somebody, from this video, from someone just solely showing up at an event? Well, let me tell you what Twitter messages you got from the organization Podcast Movement. And these are going to show up here on the screen and you can check these out. And I'm quoting here for those of you who are not watching this. Hi, folks. We owe you an apology before sessions kick off for the day. Yesterday afternoon, Ben Shapiro briefly visited the PM, Podcast Movement, 22 Expo area near the Daily Wire booth. Though he was not registered or expected, we take full responsibility for the harm done by his presence. That should scare the heck out of everybody. There is no harm done by somebody's mere presence. That's not a thing. It's just not a thing. I don't know why words are violence. That's not a thing. That not a thing. But anyway, I digress. There's no way around it. We agreed to sell, and I'm quoting again, we agreed to sell the Daily Wire a first-time booth based on the company's large presence in podcasting. The weight of that decision is now painfully clear. Shapiro is a co-founder. A drop-in, however unlikely, should have been considered a possibility. Those of you, and I continue quoting, those of you, because they sent this out in a series of tweets, those of you who called this unacceptable are right. Okay. In 9 wonderful years growing and celebrating this medium, PM, Podcast Movement, has made mistakes. The pain caused by this one will stick with us. We promise that sponsors will be more carefully considered moving forward. Just to clarify, no TDW representatives were scheduled to appear. So no, the Daily Wire representatives were scheduled to appear on panels. And Shapiro remained in the comment space and did not have a badge. If you have questions, we're here to talk. Thank you for reading, and we hope you'll continue to join us from here on out. For the love of God. You can see in this video what his actions were and what his mere presence did to bother those who were at this show. So let me take you back, right? So Podcast Movement is a good organization. They're a very beneficial podcast convention for those in the space. I've met some great people at them. So in no way am I being disparaging against actual Podcast Movement itself. However, there are issues with this line of thinking. And I contrast it because I found it highly ironic that this event happened this year when the previous year there was an incident that I actually tweeted about. So, I'll take you back to 8/5/21, and that year, the year before, it was actually in Nashville. So I was at the event in Nashville. I was actually supposed to be at the event in Dallas, and some personal things happened, and I wasn't able to make it. And I put out a tweet that said 2 things. First of all, and you'll see it here on the screen, to be clear, if you are judging others solely on race, then you are a racist. And I took a picture of a panel. And then I came back and tweeted, just listen to a panel at Podcast Movement, which said that MLK, dreaming of a world where we don't judge others by the color of their skin, rather by the content of their character, is, quote, antiquated, out of touch statement. God help us. And then I had hashtag on the blue line and hashtag podcast. So essentially what had happened is they had a morning presentation, a keynote speech, or a panel, and I had sat in on the panel to listen to them. And listen, I'm not going to agree with everybody, and that's okay. Here's what I love about the podcast medium, right? And I say this all the time. Podcasting is anybody with a voice, right? You come into the space because you believe you have something to say, whether it's about landscaping, whether it's about law enforcement, maybe it is about landscaping, whatever it is for you, business, there's all sorts of different things out there, and podcasting draws people who feel they have a voice with something to say, right? Which is a good thing. And you're going to have a lot of differing voices. That's a good thing. So the fact that there's somebody there that has a differing opinion than me, okay. Listen, I may call it out. I may say this is wrong. I might even say it's wrong on Twitter, as I did a year ago. However, I'm not going to cancel it. I'm not going to get Podcast Movement, though they wouldn't in this situation, to actually release some sort of apology for the harm done. because this is their opinion, even though it's wrong and even though it's sad. So you may be asking, well, what do you mean with this? What do you mean that statement is antiquated and out of touch when it comes to we don't judge others by the color of their skin? Well, essentially what this panel was saying is something that I consider quite racist. And for a long time in America, we considered quite racist. And this was this idea that we don't judge people by the color of their skin. But if you're not familiar, there is a whole thinking coming back, and it's out of, if you haven't heard of Ibram X. Kendi and his work called Anti-Racist, which I know some of my listeners are going to have no idea what I'm talking about, but it's in line with all of this critical race theory junk that you do hear about in the media. And one of his quotes is, quoting, "The only remedy to racist discrimination is anti-racist discrimination," which you might be thinking, what does that even mean? I'm confused. And then he goes on, "The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. And the only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination." So it's this weird thinking, and I'm not going to get into it because it's really not the purpose of this conversation, but it's this really weird thinking that you have to discriminate against somebody. The way you cure past discrimination, past racism, is by being racist. It doesn't make any sense to me, and it's wrong. It is absolutely wrong. However, they're entitled to that opinion, and their mere presence there, though wrong and should honestly be shunned from the standpoint of people that should be saying, no, we happen to be against racism in this country. That's something we're not okay with. But clearly, not only are we okay with racism, we saw from the incident with Ben Shapiro, we are also okay with bigotry. So it's a sad day in America when this kind of thing is happening, and I just wanted to bring it to your awareness because when I found it super ironic when this exact situation, not exact, but a similar situation happened a year prior, and it was handled the way it was. And in all honesty, I walked out of that panel for a little bit, and then I came back. But again, they have the right to speak. They are obviously there as speakers, and that's okay. We have differing opinions. And I think in the end, history will judge this correctly. I'm not too worried about that because we've been down this road before and we determined, I thought, that racism is bad. All right. So one important takeaway. We've been down this road before as a human race. We have seen the death that lurks in the shadows of the twists and the turns along this path. We know the inhuman and unjust endings of these actions when they fully come to term. And yet, we somehow repeat to ourselves that there's no way this is ever going to happen again. It won't happen again, we say. Not here, not now. We say it to ourselves, and we're too enlightened, right? We're too intelligent, too knowledgeable as a people. This can't happen here. Yet our willingness to vilify, dismiss, and shun those with different opinions tells us otherwise. This path begins innocently enough. We only cancel statements we don't like. I mean, they are private businesses. They can do what they want, right? We make these excuses, and we excuse and justify the elimination of that which we don't agree as though removing dangerous words is our mission to usher in this new utopia. But the next step was eliminating them completely from forums and social circles. A woke police of the modern day public square, eliminating what they deem untruthful or misleading or even dangerous, if you would. Now, the next steps have reared their ugly heads, and this dichotomy between freedom and totalitarianism has never been clearer before. In this place, we claim harm for the mere presence of someone with whom we disagree. As we saw at Podcast Movement, they cannot exist. They must be eliminated from polite society. Let me ask you, is this a country that you recognize? I mean, I recognize this country that I'm describing. I read about it in history books as a child. I heard the tales of horror, the lessons that were always cloaked as a warning of something that we would never repeat again as a species. But I mean, is this the America that you recognize? Regardless of beliefs, political association, faith, feelings, is this the America that you want and that you believe in? If what occurred at Podcast Movement was an isolated incident at an obscure trade show, then it might easily be dismissed, right? However, this destructive narrative, actions, and behaviors are not isolated. Just this last week, the most powerful man in the world, as many of you saw, on multiple occasions doubled down on hateful speech, vilifying half of the very country he was elected to represent. In a speech that a rational person could only describe as fascistic, Soviet-like, evil-esque, you pick the term, he sought to drive a wedge between society and those he described as semi-fascist and terrorist simply because they do not agree with him. The message was clear. If you dare to step out of line, dare to challenge the regime's narrative, or even think about voting against the approved regime, then you, yes, you, are the enemy. It's sad to say, but this is history repeating itself. Ask the Japanese. Ask the Jews. Ask the Chinese who lived through the Cultural Revolution. No country can survive this. These are the types of words and actions that came before the worst atrocities of history. It always starts with silencing those we don't agree with, separating them from society, and then vilifying them for being responsible for all of society's ills. The final step is something that I pray we never, ever repeat. You know, that was the brilliance of America's founding. It limited government and it guaranteed the God-given rights of the people to the people. If we could simply get back to the American ideal as written, all of these problems might begin and would begin to dissipate. None of the governmental overreaches and hateful government-sponsored cancellations can happen in a country that holds to the Constitution and to the Bill of Rights. Sure, you would still deal with private businesses, such as what occurred at Podcast Movement, but if you begin to change what is accepted, then these issues would dissipate over time as well. People would go to businesses that supported their American way of life, and businesses that continued to be bigoted in their approach would be shunned, as they always should have been. So let me just give you 3 quick ideas, and they all come down to the one important takeaway for this week. First, listen, I get it. There are some people out there that we have no middle ground with. I'm not saying to remove them from society. We don't publicly shun them. What I am saying is that unfortunately there's no middle ground. They are so given over to this religious zealotry of wokeness that nothing good is going to come from lengthy conversation. You know, Steven Crowder on his show, Louder with Crowder, touched on this just a week or so ago, where he talked about, well, some people say we're just talking past each other. It's this idea that we just don't understand each other, right? And he made it clear, and I agree, that many times this is not a matter of misunderstanding. We fully understand each other. There is just no compromise on issues that are bigoted, racist, or un-American. That being said, that only describes a small but loud portion of this country. You have friends and neighbors who have different beliefs, as do I, but believe in American exceptionalism. They are the ones that answered empathetically, no, I do not recognize this country. We should be listening to each other and having these important conversations, especially with those with whom we disagree. We have to come together as fellow Americans. Lastly, we have to be the ones, you and I, that refuse to go down this road. You know, Glenn Beck says it well on his program where he talks about don't go over the cliff with the rest of society. That is great advice for the world that we are living in. We must lock arms and in solidarity say this is not okay. We will not allow this to happen in America. The best thing that could happen is if companies would begin to be built that not right-wing companies or so-called conservative companies, but companies that believe in free markets, free speech, American exceptionalism, who refuse to bow down to the mob, simply ran by people who are not bigoted and believe in the First Amendment and the welcoming of all ideas and voices. You know, what America used to stand for. The president did say one thing this last week that I can probably meet him in the middle on. We are absolutely in a battle for the soul of this country. The life of this nation is on the ropes in the name of democracy, and if we don't rise to the challenge, we will wake up in a world that we thought would never happen again. The good news, as I say week after week after week, is that when you are the one that can make a difference, I believe in you, and I'm counting on you. All right, it is review time. Let's go over a couple reviews. This one coming to us from YouTube. And it was on the Amy Boudreau video, and they wrote, "It's a crime this video doesn't have more views." By PYB, I agree 100%. It is a crime. So could you all help with that? We don't like crime around here. This is a law enforcement podcast. So let's get more views on the YouTube channel, on the blue line. All right, and we have the other review that I want to give you this week. It's an older one because I'm going back and coming forward with them. So this was on Apple Podcasts. Great podcast, great guest, and great content. I appreciate that. And I also appreciate the 5 stars. If you're looking for useful information, intentional subject matter, and an engagement that is meaningful enough for you to invest your precious time into, look no further. Wayne Mulder, the host, provides insight and encouragement while discussing real-world stories and events and their impact on citizens, law enforcement, and other first responders. Thank you very much to KNUPS313, and thank you to each and every one of you who are listening to the podcast. Please, if you would, leave us a rating and review. If you are watching this on YouTube or Rumble, please smash that like button if you would, and please be sure to leave us a comment and anything we can do to get around these algorithms so we can get the show out to more people. I greatly appreciate it, and I greatly appreciate you listening each and every week. That's all I have for you on this morning roll call. Remember, the interview room is back Thursday at 5 o'clock in the morning, and there's always content at ontheblueline.com. So I will see you next Thursday on the podcast, but in the meantime, I'll see you out there on the Blue Line.